Hi everyone, Susanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video is going to be how I made this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, I'm using this embroidered mesh. It has a few sequins in it, makes it a nice little sparkle. I'm using this viscose lining and then this satin crepe. I really like this fabric. And then on to the cutting out. This is my back piece. I have a couple of notches at the arm. And then on to the front. My fabric underneath is on the fold. A couple of notches at my arm. A couple of notches at the bottom of my dart. And then same pieces for the lining. And now for marking those darts. So this is my back piece. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath. I'm popping a pin in at the point of each dart and then just using some tailor's chalk to mark where that pin is. Same thing on the centre of the darts. Marking with my chalk. And same thing at the bottom. And then I'm just going to connect those dots and then pin those darts together. So starting at the centre, I'm making sure my pin goes through both dart lines, trying to make sure they're nice and even the whole way up. So in through the top one, out through the bottom, and back through again. Popping a pin on the horizontal at the point of the dart. That will help me when I come to sew. And same thing on the other side. And ready to stitch. So I'm not back stitching here, I'm just starting at the point of the dart. And when I come to the center, I'm just curving nicely around back down to the bottom of the dart, and again, not back stitching. I'm going to tie off my darts. So that's how that looks. And then just tying a little knot. And that's that done. So that's the dart in my back, both lining and outer fabric complete. Now for the front. So I have the same darts at the centre and then a bust dart on either side. So just marking those in exactly the same way and pinning. And ready to stitch. So same as before, not back stitching. When I come to the centre, I'm just curving around that. I don't want to point at the centre. Just pulling my threads at the end, and I'll tie both of those off in the same way as I did the back dart. And then for the bust dart, starting at the legs of the dart and up to the point, and then I'll just tie that off there as well. So that's my front darts in and complete on both my lining and my outer fabric. So now I just have one more piece to cut out, and that's the sleeves. A couple of notches on the arms of each. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, and this is that mesh fabric. And then I have a dart here at the shoulder and a point to that dart, which I'm just marking now. I'm marking it slightly differently just to make it easier. So I've popped a pin through my pattern piece, another pin directly through that, so that I can then remove the pattern piece and then mark the darts with some thread. And I'm marking the darts here with thread rather than chalk, just because it's much easier to see. So I've just tied a little knot exactly where that pin pierces the fabric on both pieces. And I'll use that marking when I come to sew up my darts. So you'll see that in a second. So I'm going to sew up the darts in 2 stages. So the first is to sew the split So my fabric is wrong sides together. So I'm stitching at about half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And now to trim off some of that seam allowance. So I'm going to trim off about 2/3. And that's how that looks. I'm then going to pop my fabric right sides together this time. I'm going to press along that stitched seam and pin. And now I'm ready to finish my dart. So again, I'm sewing at about half of my seam allowance. I've started at my yellow thread marking the whole way down. So that's that seam all nicely enclosed. I've given it a bit of a press here. So that's that done. And now I want to finish, this is where I'm cutting now, is the shoulder. So I want to finish the shoulder with some bias binding. So I'm going to just wrap the shoulder in bias binding. So I've made myself a little piece double folded binding from the outer fabric. And now I'm using my binder foot in order to attach it. So this is a great little foot if you don't have one. It has been very useful for me. So I'm just lining up the mesh fabric with the cut edge of the bias tape. So I'm making sure that the centers line up on both. Back stitching at the start and the end. And this just wraps that whole edge in the bias tape all in one go. So it's nice and neat. So that's my sleeve ready to be attached to my dress. So I'm going to attach it to my outer fabric first, and at the neckline here I'm leaving my 1 centimeter seam allowance on my outer fabric of the main body of the dress and making sure my bias tape lines up with that. I'm making sure that I'm lining up my notches. And then I have a little bit of ease in the sleeve. So you'll see me here just easing that in nicely. So I'm just pinching the mesh fabric, popping in a pin until that ease is nice and evenly distributed. And then lining up my edges. And that's my sleeve all pinned, ready to stitch. Same thing on the other side. So to the machine, and this time again I'm going to stitch within my seam allowance. So I backstitch at the start, trying to be nice and accurate the whole way down. So that's how that looks from the outside. So now I'm ready to attach my lining, and I'm first of all going to do that at the neckline. So I've just laid my lining over the top, right sides together with the outer fabric and pinning along the neck and stitching. Back stitching at the start. I'm at my seam allowance this time, so at my 1 centimeter. Back stitching at the end. Done. So now I just need to finish that edge, so you can see I've done that here. And now I'm just under stitching, so I'm stitching through the lining to those overlock stitches you've seen there underneath, using a little bit of a longer stitch length. So that's nicely under stitched, so it's nice and neat from the outside and the inside. And now to attach the lining at the arms. So again, just folding that lining over, right sides together with the outer fabric and pinning along the arm. And this time I'm stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. So that's going to ensure that the stitch line that you just seen me sew is all nicely enclosed. It'll just give a really nice neat finish. stitching at the start and the end. So that's how that looks. So I've went ahead and finished that seam you just seen me point to there. So you can see that here. And now my lining is all nicely attached at the neckline and the armhole. Nice and neat. So now I'm ready to move on to the back. So I'm just going to repeat the same steps again with the back. So first of all, I'm going to attach the outer fabric to the sleeve. So I've just pinned that in place here. And I'm stitching within my seam allowance again. So I'm at about half of my seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. And I'm leaving myself that same little gap at the neckline, so stopping at that bias tape and leaving that 1 centimeter seam allowance there. So that's that done. And now to attach the lining. So same again, popping the lining right sides together with the outer fabric at the neckline, pinning, and ready to stitch. And again, stitching at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, back stitching at the start and the end. So that's that done. And then same thing as the front, I'm just going to lay that lining right sides together with the outer fabric, with my sleeves sandwiched in between, and I'm going to stitch this time at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. And I've left a little gap just at the underarm. That's going to allow me to much easier finish the next step, which you'll see in a second. So that's my lining attached front and back. So now, as I say, to deal with the sleeves. So I want to French seam the sleeve underarm here as well. So I'm just pinning the sleeve seams together wrong sides. And there you see that little gap on the underarm will help me immensely here to do this neatly. So I'm just going to stitch here at half my seam allowance, just in exactly the same way as I did the shoulder dart. Back stitching at the start and the end. And just to trim that fabric down. Turn the whole thing so that it's right sides together, and then stitch at about half my seam allowance again, right along that crease edge. Back stitching at the start and the end. And of course I do exactly the same on the other side. So that's my sleeves done. You can see that here, all nice and neat. So now to deal with the side seams. So I've just laid my outer fabric right sides together and pinned along both sides. My lining fabric at the top, I'm going to do exactly the same thing with. So I'm making sure that my sleeve is nicely pushed inside, and I've just pinned along the side seams of the lining as well. So you'll see here my neckline and sleeves are all in the center there, and my outer fabric to one side and lining to the other. And just stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance. So this is the outer fabric. And when I come to the underarm, I don't want to sew over the underarm seam. I want to leave that so that I can overlock that seam in a second. So I'm just back stitching there and then starting again at the other side of that seam for the lining. Back stitching at the end. And as I say, I'll go ahead and finish all of those edges on the overlocker. So that's my side seams done. So this is how it looks so far. So I've got my sleeves in, I've got all of my lining nicely attached around the neckline and the armholes. My side seams all nicely sewn up. So the next stage is to pop in a zip. So I've just lined my zip up with my outer fabric. I've left myself about an inch or so seam allowance there. And I'm using my zipper foot to attach this concealed zip. So starting at the top, sewing as close as I can to the teeth of the zip and stopping just a couple of inches before the zip pull at the bottom. So that's how that looks. And now to attach the lining. So I've just folded the lining over the top, enclosing the zipper between the outer fabric and this lining fabric. Back stitching. The only difference here is I've moved my needle over a little bit towards the right, and I've done that because I don't want my lining fabric to get caught in the zipper teeth. So you'll see how that looks in a second. So again, I need to finish the edges of those seams, but that's my lining all nicely attached around my zip. So now for my fabric below my zip, I want to pin from the bottom of the zipper to the top of the split. So you can see I've done that here on both the lining and the outer fabric. So I'm being really careful here to start my stitching right at the very last stitch that I sewed when I was putting the zipper in. That will make sure that everything is nicely lined up and nice and neat. So that's my split at the bottom, and then that's where I started and stopped my stitching. So you can see that here. And that's my lining just a little bit away from the teeth of the zip. So off camera, I've just went ahead and finished all of my edges on the overlocker. I've pressed up my hem allowance, and I have an allowance at my split as well on both the lining and the outer fabric, and I've just pinned those. I'm ready to hand stitch now, so I'm using a silk thread and a super fine needle, and I'm just running a nice herringbone stitch along the edges of the outer fabric and the lining fabric just to hold those all nicely in place. So just taking a tiny little bit of fabric from the seam and a tiny little bit of fabric from the outer. And you can see the little prick marks here. I've pressed everything, done exactly the same on the lining. And now the last thing I have to do is attach the lining to this outer fabric at the split. So I've just pinned those together, and now I'm just doing, I suppose you would call it a running stitch, just along the edges of the lining fabric, attaching it to the outer fabric. And after a nice press, that's how it looks. And that is this little dress complete. And this is what it looks like on. So I love the shape of this dress. I think it's quite a classic shape. It's got a nice bit of ease in it, so it makes it nice and comfortable. I love the mix of the two fabrics and those raglan sleeves, the little bit of scallop on the edge of the sleeve. The neckline, I like that it's quite high. I love the length of the skirt, the split at the back. I just love everything about this. This for me is my perfect cocktail dress.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do. And I shall see you guys in my next one. Bye folks!